Welcome to this explainer. Okay, if you are here to learn fast and efficiently, you have definitely found the right place. Today, we are unpacking a massive, incredibly complex structure. And honestly, the best way to wrap our heads around it is with a metaphor. Let's think about the architecture of Brazilian education as building a giant house. First, we have to pour the constitutional foundation. Then, we put up the structural framework, which is the curriculum. And finally, we get to meet the residents, the teachers, the unions, and the local communities who are actually inside managing the place. We are going to trace exactly how decades of intense legal battles and grassroots movements built the classrooms we see today. Let's get into it.
So here is our game plan for this explainer. First up, education is a right. Then we'll follow the path of the curriculum. Third, we'll look at the whole standardization versus diversity debate. Fourth, we're talking about the power of unions. And lastly, we will bring it all together with democratic school management.
Section 1. Education as a right. This is where we pour our foundation. To really understand this foundation, we have to jump back to 1985, right at the end of Brazil's civil military dictatorship. This newly formed democracy needed a totally new legal setup. Because for a long time, education was basically used as an ideological tool by the state. But then comes the 1988 Constitution, and it completely flips the script. It explicitly declared education as the very first fundamental social right. It made it a universal right and a shared duty of both the state and the family. And this was, frankly, revolutionary. It took education from being this exclusive privilege for a select few and turned it into a mandatory guarantee for absolutely everyone, specifically making sure historically excluded groups were finally brought in. Literally everything in Brazilian education today is built right on top of this exact legal bedrock.
Moving right along to Section 2, the path of the curriculum and its structural framework.
So you've just guaranteed education as a right. Great, but now the state has this massive logistical headache. How in the world do you guarantee that a kid in a remote Amazonian town is getting the same foundational quality of learning as a student right in the middle of Sao Paulo? Well, it definitely didn't happen overnight. Actually, it took almost 30 years. Back in 1988, the Constitution said, hey, we need a minimum standard. Then in 1996, a law called the LDB made it official. We needed a national common base, plus a localized curriculum. By 1997, they tried out these things called PCNs, which were early attempts at a standardized guide, but they got a lot of pushback for being too, one-size-fits-all. Finally, after literally decades of back and forth, the whole process capped off in 2017 with the approval of the BNCC.
Okay, so what exactly is this BNCC? Let's break it down because it's absolutely crucial. The National Common Curricula Base is a normative document. In plain English, it's the official rulebook. It lays out the absolutely essential step-by-step learnings that every single student, whether they're in a public school or a fancy private one, has to master throughout their basic education. It is the ultimate benchmark for what knowledge matters, and it basically drives everything from how teachers are trained to how national exams are written. But hold on, because there is a huge, critical distinction we have to make here. The BNCC itself is actually not the curriculum. It's just the mandatory reference point. Think back to our house metaphor. Right? The BNCC is the structural blueprint. It tells the builders exactly where those essential load-bearing walls have to go so the house doesn't collapse. But it doesn't pick the paint colors or buy the furniture. The actual day-to-day curriculum that gets executed by states, municipalities, and local schools, that has to include the BNCC's baseline, sure, but it can and absolutely should go way beyond it to include local culture, different teaching methods, and whatever that specific community actually needs.
And that brings us to a really fascinating tug-of-war in Section 3, Standardization versus Diversity, the ideological crossroads. As you can probably guess, trying to enforce a national baseline in a country as massive and diverse as Brazil is going to cause some friction. Curriculum design doesn't just fall out of the sky, it's heavily influenced by massive global ideologies. From an academic standpoint, there are two really distinct forces pulling at national curricula. On one side, you've got this neoconservative view, which essentially pushes for a really strong state that strictly controls values, conduct, and a very specific set of knowledge. But then on the flip side, you have the neoliberal view. This one actually wants a weaker state and leans hard into free market logic. It's all about efficiency, standardizing things just so they can be tested and measured, and focusing on global economic competitiveness. So Brazil's curriculum debate is constantly caught right in the middle of these two currents. Tight state control on one hand and market logic on the other. But here is where it gets inspiring. Social movements across Brazil weren't just going to sit back and let these top-down forces homogenize everything. They pushed back hard, and they won some massive victories for diversity. In 2003 and 2008, laws were passed that officially mandated the teaching of Afro-Brazilian and indigenous history and culture across the whole curriculum. This wasn't a gift from the government. It was the direct result of tireless historical struggles by Black and indigenous movements. They fought to ensure that the diverse, localized part of the curriculum actually reflected the true identities and histories of people who had been entirely left out of the official textbooks for generations.
Let's shift gears now to Section 4, the power of unions, the voice of the residents.
So, if the laws and rules are the architecture of our schoolhouse, the teachers and education workers are the residents actually living inside it. And let me tell you, they did not just quietly watch the house get built. Back in the late 70s and 80s, right as the military dictatorship was losing its grip, local teachers' associations started transforming. They evolved into these highly organized, incredibly powerful labor unions. And they weren't just at the table asking for a pay bump. They were deeply embedded in the much larger fight to re-democratize the entire country. They mobilized, they went on strike, and they fought relentlessly for a public education system where power was decentralized and where the workers actually had a real voice. And you know what? That grassroots mobilization completely worked. Their pressure resulted in some major constitutional victories. They legally secured the right to freely unionize and the right to strike. But maybe even more importantly, they permanently changed education policy by getting the concept of democratic management of public schools written directly into the 1988 Constitution and the 1996 LDB. Plus, they fought for professional valorization, which laid the crucial groundwork for a national salary floor. They basically forced the system to legally protect the voices of its educators.
Which leads us perfectly into our final stop, Section 5, Democratic School Management or Managing the House.
This is the exact spot where those top-down federal laws and those bottom-up social movements finally crash into an actual school building. Think about it. How do you actually manage a school democratically on a random Tuesday? Well, you do it through school councils. These are collegiate bodies made up of the actual people from the school community. Teachers, parents, students, and staff. They are the democratic bridge. They exist to make sure the people living and breathing that local community aren't just blindly taking orders from some federal office hundreds of miles away. Instead, they get to actively discuss, monitor, and vote on how their own school operates on a political, pedagogical, and administrative level.
Let's break down exactly how much power these councils wield, because honestly, it is substantial. They are definitely not just symbolic rubber stamps. First, they have deliberative power, meaning they actually get to approve projects and set internal rules. Then there's consultative power, allowing them to advise and suggest specific solutions. Crucially, they hold fiscal power. Yeah, they literally monitor the school's finances and administrative actions. And finally, they have a mobilizing function, which means it's their job to keep the wider community engaged so that democratic participation doesn't just fade away over time.
And these duties are super tangible. School councils are looking at the hard data. They're tracking dropout rates, reviewing who is passing and failing, and stepping in with real pedagogical interventions when things go off track. They are watching the budget like hawks. But, arguably, their single most important job is defining something called the Political Pedagogical Project, or the PPP.
This PPP is really the climax of our whole architectural journey today. Every single school crafts its own unique political pedagogical project. This document is the ultimate intersection point. It's where that mandatory top-down national baseline, the BNCC we talked about earlier, is handed over to the school council, who then molds it, bends it, and adapts it to fit the highly specific culture, identity, and unique needs of their own students. The state might provide the basic foundational structure, but it's the local democratic community that designs the actual lived educational experience. So, wrapping all of this up, we are left with a pretty profound tension at the very heart of Brazilian education. And it brings up a really provocative question. Is it truly democratic education achieved by standardizing exactly what we learn, making sure every single kid gets the exact same baseline of knowledge? Or is true democracy achieved by who actually gets to sit at the decision-making table inside that local school? Can you even have one without the other? It is this incredibly delicate balancing act between national cohesion and local democratic autonomy. And it is a debate that is actively shaping classrooms to this very day. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a clearer, more structured view of a deeply complex topic. Keep learning and keep asking great questions.